giving me a chance to present my oddball idea to some knowledgeable critics. So far, Bonnie's the only one who's been exposed, and she has contributed some valuable thoughts to this, although don't blame her. So, what this is about is a perceptual control model for mindfulness. Now, perceptual control theory is an offshoot of cybernetics developed by a guy named William Powers and his colleagues beginning in the 1960s. He wrote the textbook on the subject in 1973. And the thesis of perceptual control theory, which we can call PCT, is that human behavior is a manifestation of attempts to control sensory input, actual perception, to coincide with an internal reference signal, which we'll call a reference perception, through negative feedback systems. Now, we're going to go through this in detail, so it'll hopefully make more sense. This diagram really just diagrams out what I just said. You've got actual perception, a reference perception, internalized, a comparative function, which determines if they're coinciding with each other, and then if they're not, there is a drive to act in a way to restore the equivalence of these two. So let's use some simple examples. Say you're driving a car down the street. You have an actual perception of the road, the sides of the road, the lane that you're in, the motion of the car, and you have a reference perception internalized of where your car is supposed to be in the middle of the lane. And you have this function which is constantly comparing the visual experience of driving down the street and the reference signal of what that's supposed to look like. And if they are the same, you're fine. You just keep doing what you're doing. If they are different, if your actual perception is that your car is starting to drift to one side, and then it's no longer matching your reference perception, then you have this error signal, which drives a desire to act in a way to make the actual perception match the reference perception by turning the wheel. Now that happens in reality very, very quickly. If you watch someone driving, you can notice that their steering wheel is doing this. That's because they're constantly going through this negative feedback loop where as soon as there's a discrepancy between the reference perception and the actual perception, they act to correct it. And so they're constantly acting to correct that discrepancy.
Are you using the term negative feedback because there's a discomfort of some type, would you say associated?
Right. It's as soon as they are not in coincidence, then it's a negative signal. So that, and then you're acting to correct the negative signal. So another example is, as I'm standing here, I can stand without consciously concerning myself at all with trying to operate a dozen muscles and joints and the tension and trying to balance those, because I've got some perceptual input, visual, some from the semicircular canal regarding orientation with respect to gravity, some somatic sensations, but there are actual perceptions of my vertical position. If I start to waver in some way, then my reference perception, which is all vertical, begins to not coincide with my actual perception, which is starting to tilt. Well, and that generates this error signal, and in very low level circuits, unconsciously, it starts to generate different muscle tension to correct that until my actual perception is once again vertical, matching the reference perception. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
But here's the magic thing, right? So I can just do this. No error signal. But I'm no longer vertical. So what happened? Well, as it turns out, you can change this reference perception instantly and effortlessly, all the time, constantly. So you're driving down the road, you're in the middle of the road, well, time to turn the corner. Now your reference perception has got to change from being in the center of the road to actually making the turn. So you've got this reference perception at the low levels anyway is changing rapidly. And then the actual perception is you're acting to bring actual perception into equivalence with this reference perception to get rid of this error signal. Make sense? Okay, good.
Does this term negative feedback keep on coming up, or is that's you've dealt with it now?
That's really
Okay.
just the name for that particular control circuit. But that control circuit is the basis of perceptual control theory. We're still on established perceptual control theory. I'll let you know when I'm
Okay.
on my own frolicking detour.
Okay.
Okay, so the next, so we've established that you have these control circuits and that you can change the reference perception, right? Well, according to perceptual control theory, those reference perceptions are fed into the control circuits by higher level control circuits. So you've got a hierarchy of these control circuits, each feeding reference perceptions into the lower levels. Now, the perceptual control theory people postulate these different levels in the hierarchy of these control circuits. I'm just going to put that up there for you to look at. If you want to go into it, you should look at the original literature, and they describe these in detail. But the one thing I want you to know is at the lower levels, they're very basic sensory experiences. The actual immediate sensory experiences, and then muscle tension, things like that. At higher levels, they get to be more abstract and complicated. Relationships, programs, principles, system concepts, essentially covering all human activity and intellectual processes in this hierarchy of control circuits. But it's always this, still this same kind of feedback control systems. Pardon me. So this is a diagram from Powers' book. And this is a 3 levels of the hierarchy diagrammed out. I'm putting this up here so you can see it gets complicated quickly. But keep in mind, as you've seen, you can check the system works very fast, and the reference perceptions can be changed very rapidly at these low levels. This is an experiment that Powers did, where someone's using a joystick to try and keep a cursor on a screen within a randomly moving circle. And this diagram, so you can follow this at some point in your leisure time. So we okay so far? All right. This is all still William Powers' perceptual control theory. You're probably all familiar with this classic.
Yeah.
So this is where the miracle occurs now. If you think about it, if you take all of the reference perceptions within the hierarchy that makes up the whole system of human behavior, which I'm calling the aggregate of reference perceptions, compared to actual perceptions, there's a few things to note. The aggregate reference perception at the higher levels, where you're talking about concepts and relationships and value systems and so on, is static. That doesn't change. Those reference perceptions are not changing constantly in comparison to actual perception of the world, which is nothing but change. It's instantaneous change all the time. So you've got this. So what I'm trying to draw is a distinction between a static body of reference perceptions versus a dynamic actual perception. The reference perceptions are necessarily backward looking because they're taken from past experience. In order to have a reference perception for your car driving down the middle of the street, you have to have had the experience of your car in the middle of the street, and you've internalized that as a reference perception. So it's backward looking compared to actual perception existing only in the present moment and being present centered. And then additionally, you have this reference perception, this aggregate reference perception forward looking in the sense that it is anticipating what actual perception is going to look like so that they can be compared. And once again, present-centered actual perception.
So these characteristics need to be this way, or
They seem to be this way.
They're conventional.
Well, they seem to be inherent in that theory, in that theory of how they operate.
Okay.
Right, the reference perception, because of the way it's operating in the feedback system, it's backward-looking and forward-looking. And if you think about your higher level intellectual functions, they're relatively static. Okay? So my thinking is those are inherent in the reference perceptions.
Huh.
Okay, let's see. Okay. Now, another characteristic, the lower levels of the control circuits are primarily concerned with the immediate needs of survival. Eating, drinking, not being eaten, mating, breathing, right? Okay. Higher levels concern more abstract matters, values, judgments of self and others, political philosophies, and so on. So that aggregate reference perception, this body of reference perceptions at all the levels, lives in the past and the future, is fixated, static, carries even in its higher abstract levels the mortal imperative of the pure survival functions. In other words, because these lower level circuits that we have this component of survival. When you're talking about trying to control perception so that you can breathe and you can eat and so on, there's a mortal imperative, there's a survival component. And I think that if you're talking about that same circuit existing through the whole system, you end up with the same mortal imperative, that same survival drive, but now with abstract ideas. So you have values and judgments and opinions, but with this same visceral survival drive as these lower circuits that clearly have a survival function. So you have the higher abstract intellectual functions. The error signal still looks like a mortal threat. Congealing of the aggregate reference perception into a static sense of self. This is sort of the crux of the idea here. Now you've got attention is turned away from actual perception and into the reference perception by habit. As the aggregate reference perception gains complexity, gains momentum, it pulls attention away from actual perception. Limitation in time and space, because the reference perception is forward and backward looking. stress and anxiety from persistent error signals, because dynamic actual perception is all that is at odds with the static perception. So dynamic actual perception is constantly changing, but you've got lag in the higher levels of the hierarchy, and a residual sense of mortal threat from the lower levels. So that's the perceptual control theory of the coagulated and fixated sense of self.
Yeah.
Okay, so you still with me?
Yeah.
All right, now that's as far out into space as we're going to go, and hopefully we can bring it back a little bit by linking it to mindfulness. Okay, so Shinzen Young defines mindfulness as a three-part attentional skill set: concentration power, sensory clarity, and equanimity. Concentration power being the ability to focus on whatever you deem relevant for as long as you want. And that's really sort of the fundamental skill on which the other two are built. Sensory clarity is the ability to bring awareness to actual experience as it unfolds moment by moment, increasing resolution and sensitivity to what's actually occurring moment by moment in sensory experience. Equanimity is variously talked about as an attitude of acceptance, of allowing, of radical non-interference with what's arising in sensory experience. So sensory clarity in PCT terms amounts to directing attention away from the aggregate reference perception and towards actual perception. We noted that before. Equanimity, in PCT terms, is letting go of the drive to change perception in response to the error signal, or stated differently, training away the mortal imperative attached to the error signal.
Wow. If we could have a pill for that.
So let's take a look at some examples of training away the imperative of the error signal. Lower level, in lower levels in the hierarchy, and these all relate to meditation practices. Physical pain from the sitting posture. You've got a reference perception of no pain, actual perception of pain. They don't coincide, and so you've got an error signal associated with pain in the body. CO2 buildup from some breath control practices. In Harada Sensei Zen practice, for example, so that you're triggering the error signal associated with the need to breathe. Sleepiness, again, Zen is notorious for generating a state of constant sleep deprivation, as well as fear with I hate to pick on Zen, but the Keisaku and the fierce Roshi generating a sense of fear, which is, again, the reference perception is a state of no fear. Actual perception is fear. You're triggering an error signal. Heat. Some aesthetic practices involve heat. Some cold, some hunger, some celibacy. All of these are traditional contemplative practices, and they all are triggering an error signal at a low level. At a higher level, there's a practice called don't know mind. So in that case, you've got a reference perception of no confusion, you have the answers, everything's fine intellectually, and the actual perception is you don't know what's going on. You're confused, you've got questions, no answers are forthcoming, so that creates an error signal, but it's a higher level than what we were talking about here. Again, that's a well-known practice. It comes into play in koan practice, for example. So does everyone see how this is playing into the negative control loop that we talked about? So it appears to be techniques that are designed to generate that error signal, and then once you've generated the error signal, bring equanimity to it. So you're training away the drive and the error signal. And to put this in a different perspective, Shinzen Young talks about 2 dimensions of human happiness. Conditional happiness, which is getting what you want and not getting what you don't want. You know, the right job, the right partner, the right car, being physically comfortable, avoiding confusion, and having answers. So that is happiness that comes from having the actual perception be what it needs to be to match your reference perception. Unconditional happiness, being deeply content in the present moment with things as they are through the application of sensory clarity and equanimity. And I would suggest that that is, I'm trying to go back to refer to the article. Okay, so conditional happiness is acting to change actual perception so it meets the reference perception. If your job sucks, you go out and you find a better job, right? So that's conditional happiness. Unconditional happiness is working to train away the drive to make these two the same.
So a really basic thing that we get to do in our practice is that posture gets uncomfortable and we just stay with it.
Let go of resistance to it.
Yeah, there's that mental component that's adding to whatever the physical sensation, and this is another way of identifying that mental component of
Right.
resistance.
Right. And as I've thought about this, it's occurred to me that there actually may be 2 kinds of equanimity. One is training away this drive to bring actual perception into equivalence with reference perception. The other is changing the reference perception. So for example, say you were at a retreat and your room was infested with bed bugs, and as a consequence you end up going into the sit and you have this terrible itching. So you sit there, your actual perception is terrible itching, your reference perception is no itching. They're not equivalent, so you've got this error signal going on. Conditional happiness comes from taking Benadryl, right? Or you can sit there and work with the itching to train away the drive to bring these into coincidence. Or the third one is you can accept itching as your normal state and turn off this signal by actually bringing the reference perception into coincidence with the actual perception.
So when you were pointing out that the reference perception is built on these lower drives too, you're in opposition in training away your drives that basically we're hardwired with as well.
Well, that's an interesting question as to, yes, clearly at the low levels there's hardwiring, but we're changing that wiring, apparently.
To the higher functions.
Well, you're training, a lot of the training is at those low levels. When you're training with pain, you're training at a very low level.
True.
For example. But it seems to be that if you're training it away at those low levels, you're getting the higher levels too. So my thinking is that the training away this drive at any level affects all the levels. That there's something in this that's the same throughout the whole hierarchy. And that's my hope, because if that's true, there may be a neurological signal that we can identify associated with this and give us a clue as to how we can use some kind of biofeedback system to zero in on whatever is being trained here, or maybe the changing of the reference perception as well. Actually, if you think about the learning to change the reference perception, I've started calling that plasticity, reference perception plasticity. If you learn to change that reference perception, that's starting to make if the whole hierarchy of reference perceptions is the congealed sense of self, as you bring plasticity to that aggregate reference perception, you're bringing plasticity to the congealed sense of self. And that may be how something like deity yoga works, where you're deliberately changing your own reference perceptions as to who you are and what you are and how you look and everything else. And you develop plasticity in the reference perception so that it is no longer a static, congealed self as thing. So that's it. How do we do on time?
I have a remedial question.
Well, I think we're going to.
Are we going to stop?
I think we're going to have